The fog that night hung thick over Riley Road outside Fort Liberty. It was 2 in the morning, and my headlights cut through the mist like tired eyes fighting to stay open. I had just finished a late-night logistics drill, the kind that leaves your uniform heavy with sweat and your mind heavier with thoughts. The base was quiet behind me, a world of fences and silence. Ahead was nothing but darkness. I told myself I was fine. I had survived worse. I had seen dust storms and Kabul convoys trapped in the desert nights when the only sound was the thud of my own pulse in the helmet. But what I did not know was that the battlefield that would almost end me was not overseas. It was home. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The name on the screen froze my hand. Richard, my stepfather. I had not heard from him in weeks. Just the thought of his voice made my stomach tighten. Against better judgment, I answered. His tone was calm, almost soft, too soft. "Where are you, June? I just want to talk." I hesitated. He had said the same words once when I was 15, right before smashing my father's photograph against the wall. That memory sat somewhere behind my ribs, cold and sharp. "I'm heading back to base," I said. "It's late." There was a pause. Then came a sigh that felt like the air before a storm. "You always were stubborn." The line went dead. The road curved left through pine trees. The world seemed to shrink into that narrow stretch of asphalt. My radio crackled faintly with distant chatter from Fort Liberty. Nothing urgent, just static voices. I reached for the dial when the reflection caught my eye. Headlights. Behind me. Close. Too close. I shifted lanes. The car behind me followed. My pulse climbed. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe not. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield. Then I saw it. A red light, a tiny dot moving across the steering wheel. My training took over before my brain did. Sniper. My right hand jerked the wheel. The first shot shattered the windshield. The sound was not a bang, but a crack like the world splitting open. Glass burst inward, cutting my cheek. My seatbelt locked. My heart slammed. I swerved off the road, headlights spinning across trees and dirt. The second shot tore through the hood, sending smoke into the air. My car spun once twice, then flipped into the ditch. The impact knocked the breath out of me. Pain exploded across my chest. For a second, I thought my ribs had turned to dust. I smelled oil, blood, rain. The radio screamed with static. Then a voice. "Lieutenant Whitaker, do you copy Fort Liberty Dispatch? Do you copy?" I tried to speak, but all that came was a wet gasp. My fingers trembled. My uniform was soaked dark where it should not have been. I pressed my palm against my chest and felt the warmth there. My heartbeat was erratic like a drum played by a drunk hand. My vision blurred. The stars outside the broken window flickered like Morse code. I thought of my mother. I thought of how she used to say Richard was a good man, misunderstood, disciplined. I had believed her once. I had believed that control was love. My breathing slowed. I could hear the faint hum of an engine leaving. Not stopping. Leaving. The headlights vanished into the mist. It was him. It had to be him. I tried to lift my head. Pain burned down my arm. Every breath was a battle. My own voice, weak, whispered to no one. "Not like this." Through the ringing in my ears, I caught another sound. A car door slamming, footsteps, a flashlight beam cut through the smoke. "Lieutenant Whitaker, can you hear me?" It was Captain Foster. I could barely make out his shape crouching by the window. His voice was sharp with command, but his eyes, those carried panic. "Stay with me, June. Stay awake. We've got you." The words floated in and out like radio waves. Someone else shouted, "Get medevac, now!" I felt hands against my shoulder tugging at the seatbelt. My body resisted every nerve screaming. The rain hit my face cold and metallic. The helicopter's blades thundered somewhere above, growing louder. I wanted to tell them to stop, to let me rest, but I also wanted to live. Between those two wishes was the thinnest thread. My vision dimmed. My heartbeat slowed. I could hear Foster yelling something about my pulse, about pressure. I tried to answer. Instead, I whispered the truth, the one no one would understand yet. It wasn't random. He sent someone. The words barely left my lips before the world went black. The sound of my heartbeat echoed once, then again, then silence. And somewhere in that silence, I remembered the night years ago when Richard told my mother that some problems needed to be erased, not solved. Back then, I thought he meant words. Now I knew better. That was the night my stepfather decided control was not enough. That was the night he decided a bullet was easier. When I woke again, hours or maybe days later, I was under hospital lights, unable to speak, my chest bandaged. The beeping beside me told me I had made it. The whisper inside me told me I should not have. I stared at the ceiling at the shadow of the IV line across my arm, and all I could think was one sentence, the only one that mattered now. He failed. He missed. And I was still here. When I woke up, the world smelled like antiseptic and metal. The ceiling above me was white and humming, and a thin line of light ran across it from the fluorescent panel. My throat burned when I tried to breathe. Somewhere, a monitor kept time with the steady rhythm of my heart, proof I was still alive. A nurse spoke softly near my bed, her voice muffled through the fog of medication. "You're safe now, Lieutenant Whitaker," she said. "You made it through the surgery." Safe. The word didn't fit. The pain in my chest wasn't just from the wound. It was something older, deeper, carved long before that night. The room faded in and out of focus. Between the beeps and the whispers, another sound began to echo, a voice that belonged to a man I had tried for years to forget. "Stand straight, June. Don't slouch. You look weak when you slouch." The words came from 17 years ago from the kitchen of a small house in Wilmington, North Carolina. My stepfather, Richard Hale, stood by the table wearing his Army drill shirt, even though he'd been retired for years. The sleeves were rolled tight around his thick arms, veins visible beneath the tan skin that seemed permanently sunburned from too many summers at Camp Lejeune. My mother, Evelyn Whitaker, was sitting across from him, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. Richard liked silence. He said silence kept order. To him, laughter was noise, crying was weakness, and disagreement was insubordination. When I was 14, I learned that lesson well. He ran the house like a base, and my mother followed orders like a good soldier. That morning, I had come home late from school after staying to help with a science project. Richard was waiting. "What kind of officer shows up late?" he asked. His tone was calm, always calm, which made it worse. "I'm not an officer," I said, clutching my backpack. "I'm just a kid." He smiled, a thin line that never reached his eyes. "Not in my house, you're not. In my house, you follow command." My mother looked at me, then her eyes pleading silently for me not to argue, so I lowered my head. I thought it would end there. It didn't. He went on for 10 minutes telling me about discipline, responsibility, control. I remember every word because each one felt like a nail in my spine. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, I realized something that would define the rest of my life. Richard didn't want a family. He wanted a unit to command. He controlled everything: what my mother wore, what music played in the house, what I was allowed to say at dinner. If I tried to speak about my real father, Michael Whitaker, who had died overseas when I was 6, Richard's jaw would tighten. "Enough about ghosts," he would say. "You live under my roof now." My mother used to be soft-spoken but warm. After years with him, her warmth turned brittle. She said things like, "He means well," or "He just wants what's best for you." But her hands would shake when she poured coffee. I started spending more time at school, volunteering for everything: cleanup crews, tutoring, anything to stay away from home. The teachers thought I was ambitious. I wasn't. I was surviving. Sometimes when Richard would leave for errands, Mom and I would breathe for a few hours. We'd make grilled cheese sandwiches and sit in the backyard pretending everything was normal. She'd smile, and for a moment she looked like herself again. But the second his car pulled back into the driveway, the air would change. We would both go quiet as if waiting for inspection. That was my first lesson about power. The quiet can be as violent as the noise. By the time I turned 16, the walls of that house had memorized my silence. Every photo of my real father was gone, replaced by Richard's framed certificates and medals that gleamed under the hallway light. He called it discipline. I called it erasure. My mother, Evelyn, pretended not to notice. She lived in a constant half-apology, a woman walking on a tightrope over his moods. I learned to read her face like a map of warnings. A furrowed brow meant he'd been drinking. A shaking hand meant stay in your room. I tried to make myself invisible, but Richard hated invisibility. He said silence was deceit. One evening he came home earlier than usual, boots heavy on the linoleum. "June," he barked, "where's your report card?" I handed it to him, trembling slightly, though I'd made the honor roll. His eyes scanned the page. "History B+, he said. "You're getting lazy." He tore the paper in half and dropped it on the table. "A soldier doesn't settle for less than excellence." I wanted to say I wasn't his soldier. The words rose like fire in my throat, but died before reaching air. Mom stood nearby holding a dish towel, her eyes watery. Richard turned toward her. "What are you looking at?" She lowered her gaze immediately. Later that night, I sat on my bed and wrote in my notebook, "I will leave. I don't know when, but I will leave." Those words became my quiet rebellion. Over the next year, I applied for every ROTC scholarship, every early enlistment option. The Army to me was not escape. It was structure without cruelty, command without fear. The irony didn't hit me until much later that I was running from a man in uniform by putting one on myself. Graduation day came hot and heavy with Carolina humidity. Mom was in the audience, pale and small under the bleachers. Richard didn't come. He said he didn't support wasting taxpayer money on girls who play soldier. I saw her scanning the crowd for him anyway. When the ceremony ended, she hugged me quickly, whispering, "Don't make him angry when you tell him." I didn't have to. He already knew. That night I found my suitcase open on the floor of my room, my clothes dumped out. Richard stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You think you can defy me?" he said. I tried to hold my ground. "I'm 18 in 3 months, I replied. "I'll sign the papers myself." His jaw twitched. "You're throwing away your life." "No," I said quietly. "I'm taking it back." He stepped closer, his shadow covering mine on the carpet. For a second I thought he might hit me. He didn't. He just smiled, that same thin, poisonous smile. "You'll regret it," he said. "The world will eat you alive and you'll come crawling back." I remember the smell of his aftershave mixed with anger. I remember the way my mother's voice broke when she said my name as I walked out the door. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The bus station in Wilmington smelled of diesel and rain. When I bought my one-way ticket to Fort Jackson, the clerk asked if I was nervous. I said no, but my hands were shaking. As the bus pulled away, I watched the city lights fade behind me. Somewhere in that fading glow was the girl who had learned to whisper, to obey, to endure. She would not survive basic training, but maybe that was the point. I was ready to let her go. Fort Jackson was blistering that summer, the kind of heat that soaked through your uniform and burned patience right out of you. The first morning of basic training, I stood in formation among 70 strangers, all of us stripped of our pasts, waiting for orders. When the drill sergeant shouted, I didn't flinch. I knew that voice, or at least a version of it. Command no longer frightened me. It grounded me. Every push-up, every timed run, every shouted correction felt like proof that I could rebuild myself without Richard's shadow. At night, when the barracks lights dimmed, I'd press my hands together under the blanket and whisper, "Keep going." It wasn't a prayer. It was a promise. The Army gave me rules, but they were rules with purpose. Obedience here didn't come from fear. It came from shared survival. I learned logistic structure precision, and for the first time, the weight of authority didn't feel like chains. It felt like armor. By the time I finished my initial training, I was one of the top graduates. The commander called my name, "Whitaker, you've got control in your blood." I smiled, but only halfway. If he knew where that control came from, he wouldn't have called it a compliment. My assignment took me first to Fort Drum, then overseas. I wrote to my mother every month. Sometimes she answered, sometimes she didn't. The letters I received were careful, cautious. "Richard is proud of you," she would write. Though the words felt borrowed, I kept them folded in my footlocker next to the last photograph I had of my real father. In it, he's smiling in a desert uniform, the sun turning his hair gold. I used to think I could see part of him in me, the part that kept choosing to stand when every instinct screamed to hide. 6 years passed before I set foot in North Carolina again. When I returned for a short leave, my hometown felt smaller, quieter, like a stage stripped after a show. Richard's truck was still in the driveway. The house looked the same, only the paint was older and the windows had bars. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She looked older too, thinner, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She smiled, but the corners of her mouth trembled. "You look strong," she said. "He's proud of that uniform." The mention of him made the air between us shrink. I asked where he was. "At the range," she said, and her voice faltered on the word. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee that tasted like memory. The silence between us was louder than any argument. Finally, she said it barely above a whisper. "Don't push him, June. He's been on edge. Sometimes he says things I know he doesn't mean." I looked at her and saw the girl she once was, buried under years of submission. "Mom," I said softly, "if you ever need to leave, I can help." She shook her head immediately. "No, you don't understand. He's not cruel. He just loses control." That word again. Control. It followed me everywhere like a ghost wearing his voice. I left the next morning before sunrise. I didn't hug her. I couldn't trust my hands not to shake. On the flight back to base, I opened my journal and wrote the same sentence I had written years earlier: "I will leave." Only this time I added 4 more words. "But I will return." The sound of engines hummed beneath me, steady, powerful. I thought of the ocean between duty and fear, and I realized something that stayed with me until the night of the shooting. Control is not power. It is fear disguised as order. I learned that from him, and someday he would learn what it cost me. 8 years later, the air at Fort Liberty carried a different weight. The pine trees along Riley Road looked the same, but I wasn't the same woman who had left North Carolina with a backpack and a dream of freedom. The Army had given me discipline scars and a spine made of steel, but it hadn't erased the past. When my reassignment orders came through, I almost laughed at the irony. Back to Fort Liberty, back to the shadow of that house. The moment my boots touched the tarmac, the humidity wrapped around me like a memory that refused to die. I tried to convince myself it was just another posting, another rotation, but deep down, I knew this return was a reckoning I hadn't asked for. My quarters on base were small but clean, a simple room with regulation furniture and a window overlooking the airfield. At night, I would watch the planes come and go, the sound of engines masking thoughts I didn't want to face. On my second weekend back, I drove to Wilmington. The closer I got to my mother's neighborhood, the slower I drove, as if the car itself was resisting. The house stood exactly as it had years ago. Same faded paint, same sagging porch swing that used to creak whenever my father sat there reading letters from deployment. The moment I parked, the front door opened. My mother, Evelyn, stood framed by the porch light, her hands clutching a worn dish towel. "June," she said softly. Disbelief and relief tangled in her voice. When she hugged me, I felt how fragile she had become. Her arms, once strong from gardening, now felt like bird bones. The kitchen still smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee, but something else lingered beneath it, tension old and sour. My eyes moved to the wall where my father's photograph used to hang. It was gone. In its place, a larger frame displayed Richard in his old uniform, the glare of the glass catching the light like a smirk. I stared at it until she noticed. "He wanted it there," she whispered, avoiding my eyes. "He said your father's picture didn't fit the theme of the house anymore." The words hit harder than I expected. "Theme," I repeated quietly. "Since when does grief have a theme?" She flinched, but didn't answer. The back door slammed. Heavy footsteps. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Richard Hale stepped into the kitchen, older, but not weaker. His hair had grayed, his posture still rigid. "Lieutenant Whitaker," he said with mock formality. "Didn't think the Army would send you crawling back here." His voice was smooth, confident, the same tone he'd used to break me years ago. I met his eyes and forced a smile that didn't reach mine. "I'm here on assignment, not nostalgia," I said. He leaned closer, his breath faintly laced with bourbon. "A soldier is always home where discipline lives. Don't forget who taught you that." I didn't reply. But in that moment, I knew this house hadn't changed. It was still his base, and my mother was still his soldier. That night, I lay awake in the small guest room across the hall from my mother's. The ceiling fan spun slow circles, its shadow cutting across the walls like a pendulum marking the time I had already lost here. Every creak of the floorboards outside made my stomach tighten. I had faced incoming fire before, but this kind of danger, the quiet domestic kind, was different. It was patient. It waited until you thought you were safe, then whispered reminders that you never were. Around midnight, I heard my mother's voice in the kitchen, low and careful. Then his deeper, sharper. I caught only fragments, words like money loan and don't start again. I didn't move, afraid they would hear me. When the house finally fell silent, I stared at the dark ceiling and promised myself that in the morning I would understand what he was hiding. The next day, I joined my mother for breakfast. She moved slower than I remembered, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. "You don't have to stay long," she said, eyes fixed on the counter. "Richard likes his space." "Does he?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Because it looks like he's taken all of it." She flinched, then forced a weak smile. "He's under stress. The market's been bad. He's trying." I didn't believe her, but I didn't push. Instead, while she went to the garden, I opened the small drawer by the phone where she used to keep the household ledger. It was still there. Neat handwriting, every expense recorded. The last few months, however, looked wrong. Payments to names I didn't recognize, large withdrawals labeled home repair, consulting, vet bills. My mother didn't own a pet. I copied the details into my notebook and felt my pulse quicken. When I looked up, Richard was standing in the doorway. His expression was calm, almost amused. Still playing detective, he asked. I closed the book slowly. "Just checking on Mom's bills. Some numbers don't add up." He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Your mother trusts me with everything. You should too." I smiled tightly. "Trust is earned." His eyes narrowed. "You think the army made you brave, but it just made you predictable. You follow rules. I make them." He turned away, and before he disappeared down the hall, he added, "Be careful what you dig for. Some graves are better left closed." The words stayed with me long after he was gone. That evening, I found my mother sitting on the back porch staring into the trees. The fading sunlight made her look translucent, as if she were fading into the life he had built around her. "Mom," I said gently, "are you missing money from your account?" She hesitated, then looked at me with tired eyes. "Don't ask questions, June. You'll end up like your father." My breath caught. "What does that mean?" She turned away, her shoulders shaking. "Some truths aren't safe." I wanted to press her, but something in her voice made me stop. For the first time, I realized she wasn't just protecting him. She was protecting me. For the next week, I stayed longer than planned, pretending it was about visiting my mother, but really it was about watching him. Richard moved through the house with the confidence of a man who believed he owned every breath inside it. He managed her doctor appointments, her groceries, even her phone calls. Every night he poured himself a glass of bourbon and sat in my father's old chair, the same chair that once smelled of tobacco and sea salt. Now it smelled of alcohol and arrogance. I tried to talk to Mom again, but her eyes darted toward the hallway every time I said his name. She was afraid of sound, as if words themselves could summon him. On Sunday afternoon, while she napped, I took a walk to clear my head. Wilmington was warm and heavy with the scent of salt and magnolia. I walked past the church we used to attend and noticed a flyer taped to the notice board, Richard Hale listed as guest speaker for a veterans fundraiser. My stomach twisted. He had rebuilt himself as a local hero, collecting sympathy and donations. I wondered how many people knew what he was behind closed doors. When I returned, his truck was gone. Mom was awake, pacing the kitchen, her hands clutching the phone. She hung up as soon as she saw me. "Who were you calling?" I asked. "Just the pharmacy," she said too quickly. Then, as if the weight of the lie was too much, she added, "Richard's been borrowing against the house. He says it's for investments, but I think he's losing money." I took her hand. "You don't have to stay here." She looked at me, eyes glassy, and whispered, "It's not that simple." He would never let me leave. The sound of gravel crunching outside cut her off. His truck pulled in. She squeezed my hand once, a silent plea. "Don't say anything." Dinner that night was quiet. He watched me over the rim of his glass, smiling in a way that dared me to speak. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You've done well for yourself." "Officer, maybe you can teach your mother about loyalty." I set my fork down slowly. Loyalty isn't obedience. His smile tightened. "Depends who writes the rules." The air between us thickened. For a moment, no one breathed. Then he laughed softly and raised his glass. "To family," he said. Mom's hand shook so badly the water spilled from her cup. Later, after he went to bed, I found her sitting on the edge of the sofa staring at the dark window. "He won't stop, June," she whispered. "Not until everything he can't control is gone." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she just shook her head and said, "Promise me you'll be careful when you're driving back to base." That night, as I packed my bag, I saw movement through the window. Richard outside phone pressed to his ear, watching the road. The porch light glinted off his watch, a single red reflection that reminded me of something I couldn't yet name. The sky over Fort Liberty was low and restless that night, the kind of Carolina darkness that swallowed headlights whole. I had left my mother's house hours earlier, her warning still echoing in my mind. The drive back to base was supposed to be a straight route, 30 miles of quiet asphalt between Riley Road and the outer perimeter. I told myself to shake it off. Richard liked mind games. He wanted me uneasy. But something about the way he watched me pack, the way he whispered into his phone outside, stayed sharp in my memory. At 2:30 a.m., the roads were nearly empty. The dashboard clock glowed faint green, the only sound the low hum of the engine. My body ached from tension. I kept replaying the dinner, his smile, the way he said to family like a threat. The base checkpoint was still 20 minutes ahead when my phone lit up on the seat beside me. Unknown number. My thumb hovered over decline, then instinct made me answer. "Lieutenant Whitaker," I said. Silence. Then a voice, his voice, calm, almost affectionate. "You drive too fast at night, June. You should be careful on those back roads." The air left my lungs. "How do you know where I am?" I asked. A quiet chuckle. "You think I stopped watching over you? I taught you everything you know about awareness. Consider this a reminder." My pulse thundered. "What do you want, Richard?" "Nothing," he said. "Just making sure you get home safe." Then the line went dead. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a long minute, I stared at the phone, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. Instead, another sound rose, the faint hum of tires behind me. I glanced into the rearview mirror. Headlights. A pickup truck, dark color, no plates visible in the reflection. Too close. I slowed. The truck slowed. I accelerated. It matched my speed. I felt that old military instinct kick in, the quiet calculations between fear and control. 2 miles to the training route turnoff. If I could reach the access road near the field range, there'd be motion sensors and cameras. I flicked my signal and turned onto the dirt path. The truck followed. The narrow road cut through tall pine and brush, the branches clawing at my mirrors. My heartbeat synced with the rattle of gravel beneath the tires. Then the headlights behind me blinked once, off on off again. A signal. My chest tightened. I reached for my radio, flipped to the base frequency. Static hissed no response. Out of range. The air felt heavier now. Then I saw it, a red shimmer moving across the steering wheel. For half a heartbeat, my brain refused to name it. When the dot climbed up my arm, recognition hit like ice water. A laser. I slammed my foot on the brake, throwing the car sideways. The first shot cracked through the window glass, exploding across the dashboard. The sound was sharp, surgical. My ears rang. The second shot tore through the driver's door. I ducked low, pressing my chest against the console. Smoke and dust filled the cabin. I gunned the accelerator tires, spinning the car, fishtailing down the dirt road. Another shot. The rear window shattered. Wind roared inside, whipping my hair into my face. I could barely see, only the flash of trees and gravel as the world turned into chaos. I tried to radio again, yelling into the mic. "This is Lieutenant Whitaker, off base Riley Road, shots fired." Static answered. Then the world tilted. The front tire hit a ditch and the car flipped. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the shimmer of red light cutting through the rain. The world had flipped sideways. For a moment, there was no sound, only a high ringing in my ears, like the aftermath of an explosion. I couldn't tell if I was alive or suspended somewhere between pain and silence. The car rested on its side, metal groaning and hissing as the engine sputtered its last breaths. My seatbelt dug deep into my shoulder, my body twisted against the steering column. Smoke drifted in through the shattered window, carrying the sharp tang of gasoline. My right hand trembled as I tried to move. Pain exploded through my chest, hot, dense, alive. I pressed my palm against it and it came away wet. Even in the faint moonlight, I could see the dark smear of blood. My breath hitched. The bullet had found me after all. Somewhere outside, a vehicle door slammed. Footsteps crunched through gravel. I froze, forcing my breathing to slow. The footsteps stopped near the wreck, a man's voice low and impatient. He said it was done. Another answered closer. Check. Don't assume. A flashlight beam cut through the broken windshield, sweeping across my face. I bit my lip hard enough to taste iron, willing myself not to move. The light lingered on me, then shifted away. She's dead, one of them muttered. The other grunted. Then, let's go. No use sticking around. Their steps retreated. The truck's engine roared to life, then faded into the distance. For a long time, I stayed frozen, afraid to believe they were gone. My vision swam, my heartbeat slowing to a distant echo. Somewhere in the fog of pain, a voice inside me whispered, "Not yet." I fumbled for the radio again. It hung above me, cracked, but still glowing faintly. I pressed the transmit button, whispering, "This is Lieutenant Whitaker, off Riley Road. Need assistance. Please." The static answered, followed by a faint crackle. Then a voice. "Lieutenant Whitaker, say again. What's your location?" The sound jolted me awake. I pressed the button again, forcing air into my lungs. "Ambushed. Off-base route? Vehicle down. Possible gunshot wound." "Copy that," the voice replied. "Stay where you are, we've got units en route." The words blurred together, dissolving into noise as darkness crept in again. I woke to a different sound, the rumble of tires and flashing blue lights cutting through the night. Shapes moved outside the wreck. Someone shouted, "Over here! She's alive!" Hands pulled at the door, metal screaming as it gave way. A man's face appeared in the shattered frame. Captain Drew Foster, his uniform soaked from rain, eyes wide with urgency. "June. Stay with me," he barked. My lips parted, but the words came out as a whisper. "He sent them." Foster leaned closer. "Who, Lieutenant?" "Who sent them?" I tried to speak again, but my throat burned. "Richard," I managed. His eyes flickered with shock, then focus. "We've got you," he said firmly. "You're not dying on my watch." The medics moved fast, cutting the seatbelt, lifting me onto a stretcher. The air outside was cold, laced with the smell of pine and gasoline. I caught fragments of voices, gunshot entry near sternum pressure dropping, prepare for airlift. Foster kept pace beside the stretcher, gripping my hand through his gloves. "You hear me, Lieutenant? You keep your eyes open." I tried to nod, but the world was slipping sideways again. A helicopter's rotors thundered overhead, wind tearing through the trees. The medics lifted me up, loading me into the chopper. My chest felt heavy, each breath a mountain. As the doors closed, Foster's voice cut through the noise. "Tell me who did this, June." I looked at him, my vision fading into black edges, and whispered, "You already know." The helicopter lifted off, and the darkness finally won. The rhythm of the rotors became my heartbeat. I drifted between flashes of light and the hollow silence that waits just beyond pain. Someone was shouting over the noise, "BP falling, prepare EPI," but it sounded far away, like a conversation happening underwater. I caught glimpses through half-open eyes, the medic's gloved hands, the green monitor flickering a patch of blood soaking through the gauze on my chest. Every time the helicopter lurched, I felt the wound pulse, as if the bullet had carved a second heartbeat inside me. Then I was gone again. I floated somewhere cold and vast, a place with no edges, no sound, just a slow echo of memory. My mother's face, my father's laugh, Richard's eyes the night he told me discipline was love. I tried to move, but my body wasn't mine anymore. For one fragile moment, I thought maybe this was peace. Then, Somewhere deep inside, a single word rose like a flare through darkness. Fight! A jolt ripped through my chest. Pain surged, blinding. Someone was shouting, "She's flatlining!" Another voice, steady commanding, hit her again. Electricity surged. My body arched. For a second, I thought I screamed, but there was only the sound of rain on metal. The second shock hit harder. My heart stuttered once, then found its rhythm, weak but alive. The medic leaned over me. "Stay with us, Lieutenant." I tried to answer, but the world dissolved into lights and shadow. When I woke again, the hum of the helicopter had turned into the sterile beep of hospital monitors. The smell of antiseptic filled the air sharp enough to sting. I was in a hospital room, ceiling lights washing everything in cold white. My chest ached with every breath, a deep burn under the bandages. Voices drifted around me. Foster's low tone, the clipped efficiency of nurses. One said, "We stabilized her at 0230. The round missed the heart by less than an inch." Another replied, "That's luck or a miracle." I opened my eyes fully. Foster stood near the bed, his uniform streaked with dirt and blood. When he saw me move, relief flashed across his face. "Welcome back," he said quietly. My throat was dry. "Where?" "Womack Army Medical," he said. "You've been out for 6 hours. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You almost didn't make it." My hand twitched, reaching for my chest. Bandages thick and warm. The bullet I asked. "Removed," he said. "You'll live." I turned my head toward the window. Outside, the dawn was breaking pale and distant. It felt unreal, as if the world shouldn't still exist. Foster leaned closer. "Do you remember anything? Who did this?" I stared at the ceiling, the memory of that phone call slicing through the fog. "It wasn't random," I whispered. "He sent someone." His eyes narrowed. "Richard." I nodded, too tired to explain. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm beside me. Foster exhaled slowly. "Then we'll find proof. But for now, you rest." He started to step away, but I caught his sleeve. "Don't tell my mother yet," I said. "She'll defend him." His silence said everything. He placed a hand over mine briefly. "You're safe for now." Then he turned and left. I lay there listening to the machine's hum, the rain soft against the window. My chest rose and fell with effort, each breath a reminder that I was still here. Somewhere deep inside, the anger began to take shape, quiet, alive, patient, the kind of anger that doesn't explode. It waits. The first thing I remember after the surgery wasn't the pain. It was the silence. A deep, clinical silence that felt too deliberate, too sterile, as if the world was holding its breath around me. 3 days had passed since the shooting, though time meant nothing. The rhythm of the heart monitor was my only proof that I still belonged to the living. The doctors called it a miracle. I called it unfinished business. My body was wrapped in layers of gauze, my left side burning every time I tried to move. The bullet had grazed my heart-shattered bone and lodged close enough to make the surgeon whisper a millimeter more and she'd be gone. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt hunted. Each time the door creaked open, I half expected Richard's shadow to appear. On the 4th night, I woke to find the lights dimmed the hallway beyond my room, quiet, except for the distant squeak of wheels. I tried to shift pain cutting sharp through my ribs. My phone sat on the bedside tray, new government issued after the CID agents confiscated the one from the crash. The screen blinked once. Unknown number. My fingers shook as I picked it up. A text appeared. "You should have stayed gone." I froze, staring at the words until my pulse screamed in my ears. I pressed the call button for the nurse, but before she arrived, the message disappeared. "Deleted remotely." My hands trembled. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. Instead, I said I needed more pain meds. She nodded, adjusted the IV, and left. I stared at the ceiling long after she was gone, replaying the message in my head. There was no doubt it was him. The following morning, CID came for a brief interview. 2 agents, polite but detached. "Lieutenant Whitaker, do you have any reason to believe this attack was targeted?" one asked. I studied their faces. Both looked young, eager for clean answers. "I do," I said finally. "My stepfather." They exchanged a look. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet." The younger one sighed, jotting something in his notebook. "We'll keep this open as an ongoing investigation. For now, focus on recovery." Focus on recovery. The phrase echoed like an insult. They left a card on my table and walked out, closing the door softly as if sealing me in. When the night nurse came by later, she found me awake, staring out the window. "You military types never rest," she joked. I smiled faintly, but inside I felt the familiar weight of helplessness pressing against my lungs. My phone buzzed again that night. No message, just a blank screen lighting up. I placed it face down. I wasn't ready to read the next threat. Not yet. The bullet had missed my heart, but Richard hadn't. He'd hit something deeper, a wound you can't stitch closed. The days blurred together in a haze of morphine and whispered check-ins. Each morning, the nurses changed my dressings, the antiseptic burning like fire against the wound. I learned to measure time, not by clocks, but by the shift of sunlight through the blinds, by the sound of boots echoing in the hallway, by the quiet dread that settled each night when the lights dimmed. The doctors said I was healing well. They didn't see the sleeplessness, the constant tension that made my hands tremble whenever the phone buzzed. On the 7th day, I heard a familiar voice outside my room, soft, hesitant, as though afraid to be there. "She's awake." My chest tightened before I even saw her. "Evelyn." My mother stepped in carrying a bouquet of lilies she'd probably bought at the hospital gift shop. Her hair, once the color of honey, was streaked with silver now, and she looked smaller somehow. Her shoulders slumped like she was trying to fold herself out of sight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Oh, June." She set the flowers on the table and reached for my hand. Her touch was cool, trembling. "You scared me half to death." I almost laughed at the irony. "I scared you." She blinked, looking down. "Richard told me it was an accident, that maybe you fell asleep driving. He said you've been working too hard." The words hit harder than any bullet. I stared at her, trying to see if she believed it. She did. Or maybe she needed to. "You believe him," I said flatly. "After everything, you still believe him." Tears welled in her eyes. "June, please. He's your stepfather. He loves you in his way." I turned my face toward the window, swallowing the bitterness that rose like bile. "His way nearly killed me." She squeezed my hand, desperate. "Don't make things worse. Please, not again." That sentence, the same one she used when I was 14 when I begged her to leave him. Back then I stayed silent because I thought she needed peace. Now I realized that silence wasn't peace. It was surrender. "Mom," I said quietly. "He's watching me even now. I got a message." Her hand froze. "A message?" "Don't act surprised," I said. "You know what he's capable of." Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to me. "If you say that again, someone might hear." She whispered it, but it felt like a command. That was when it hit me she wasn't here to comfort me. She was here to control the damage. I leaned closer, my voice low but sharp. "You're afraid of him. Even now." Her silence was answer enough. When she finally stood, she smoothed her blouse and said, "Try to rest." Then she left without looking back. I watched the lilies on the table already beginning to wilt under the fluorescent light. That night, I realized something I'd been avoiding. Richard didn't just train me to fear him, he trained everyone, and fear in our family had become a language no one dared to stop speaking. 3 weeks after the shooting, the nurses finally removed the stitches. The scar was a dark crescent just below my collarbone, a reminder that death had missed me by an inch. I couldn't lift my arm fully yet, but I forced myself to move to reclaim each nerve that pain had tried to erase. On the morning I was cleared for light physical therapy, a knock came at the door. When I turned, a woman stood there in uniform, short blonde hair, sharp brown eyes, the kind of presence that fills a room without trying. "Sergeant Maggie Rowe," she said, grinning faintly. "You look like hell, Whitaker." For the first time in weeks, I almost smiled. "You always knew how to make an entrance," I rasped. She pulled a chair beside my bed. "Foster told me what happened. He said you're lucky to be alive." Luck had nothing to do with it, I said quietly. It was unfinished business. Her grin faded. You think it was him, don't you? Hale, I know it was. I told her about the phone call, the text message, my mother's visit. She listened, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing with every detail. You reported it to CID. They smiled, took notes, and told me to rest. Of course they did, she muttered. No one wants to accuse a retired training officer without proof. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Then, let's find proof. That sentence lit something in me, a spark I didn't realize I'd been waiting for. She slid a small notepad across the tray. Start writing everything down. Times, names, calls, every detail you remember. You taught half the logistics team how to document field ops, now use that brain on your own case. I nodded slowly. That night after the nurses made their rounds, I opened the notepad. The paper smelled like starch and ink. I started writing. Every word felt like a small act of rebellion. I wrote about the headlights, the laser dot, the voices outside the wreck, the sound of Richard's tone on the phone. I wrote until my hand cramped. By midnight, I had pages filled with anger, suspicion, and fragments of memory. But somewhere between those lines, something changed. The writing stopped feeling like therapy. It started feeling like strategy. The silence I'd carried all my life was becoming a weapon. A quiet kind of revenge. The kind that waits, collects, observes. The kind that doesn't shout, it strikes with precision. Before dawn, I flipped the notebook shut and hid it inside a medical supply drawer. When the nurse came in, she found me awake. Couldn't sleep, she asked. Didn't need to, I said. I've got work to do. When she left, I turned my head toward the window. The faint reflection of the scar glimmered under the hospital light. It didn't look like weakness anymore. It looked like a warning. The bullet that grazed my heart hadn't just spared my life, it had reshaped it. Richard thought he'd silenced me, but he'd only taught me how to listen to patterns, to fear, to opportunity. And the next time he came for me, I'd be ready to answer. By the time I was cleared for active duty work again, the scar had faded into a pale mark beneath my collarbone, but the ache beneath it never left. They called it residual trauma. I called it memory. 6 months had passed since the night on Riley Road. The investigation into the accident had stalled. No new leads, no suspects, no proof of anything beyond bad luck. I could have let it fade into rumor, let Richard win through silence. Instead, I did what he never expected. I returned to Fort Liberty. The Army Intelligence Liaison Office wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what I needed access. I handled logistics and data coordination between field agents and local law enforcement. That meant spreadsheets, transfer ledgers, and enough numbers to bury secrets if one knew where to look. And I did. Each night after the others left, I stayed behind under the hum of fluorescent lights, scrolling through secure archives. I started with Richard's old training files, financial forms tied to his consulting business. Nothing obvious. But Richard was never sloppy. He'd built his control on precision. I expanded the search to external accounts, any retired officers linked to his name. 2 weeks in, I found it a wire transfer dated 1 week before the shooting for $12,000. Origin Evelyn Hale joint account. Recipient Clint Mercer. The name caught me like a hook. Mercer, a former weapons instructor dishonorably discharged in 2013 for contract misconduct. The record was thin, but one line in his background check burned into my mind. Former sniper, 10th Mountain Division. A sniper. I printed the record and sat back in my chair, the air feeling heavier. It fit too well, too perfectly. I forwarded the document to my private email, then deleted the log from the system. My fingers shook as I zipped my jacket. I'd been trained to analyze, not to hunt, but this was personal. I drove home under the dim light of Fayetteville's street lamps, the city still asleep. Inside my apartment, I pinned the printed papers to the wall above my desk. Richard's bank transaction, Mercer's profile photo, the date of the attack circled in red ink, a triangle of truth forming out of data. My pulse steadied. For the first time since the shooting, I had something solid proof that the bullet wasn't random, that control had turned into conspiracy. That night before closing my eyes, I whispered into the darkness, "You should have finished the job, Richard, because now I'm coming for you." The drive to Tennessee felt like crossing into another version of myself. The road stretched endlessly long ribbons of asphalt, cutting through fields that smelled of rain and diesel. I'd told no one where I was going, not Foster, not Maggie, not even the liaison office. Some truths required solitude to surface. By the time I crossed into Clarksville, the sky had dimmed to a bruised gray. I had tracked Clint Mercer to a roadside bar off Highway 79, a place called the Rusted Barrel. The kind of place where no one asks questions as long as you pay cash. I parked the car, my hand resting briefly over the scar on my chest. The air smelled of beer cigarettes and motor oil. Inside, dim neon lights flickered over a handful of men hunched at the counter. The jukebox in the corner hummed low country blues. It took less than 10 seconds to spot him tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture soldiers never lose even after they've stopped serving. Mercer. He sat alone nursing a beer, the faint white line of an old scar cutting through his jaw. I approached quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. Clint Mercer. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. Depends who's asking. Lieutenant June Whitaker. I said, my voice steady. You aimed at my heart 6 months ago. His eyes flicked to my scar, then back to my face. He exhaled slowly, like a man who'd been expecting this moment. I didn't expect you to walk in here alive. You didn't try hard enough, I said. The silence between us thickened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then leaned closer. I wasn't supposed to kill you. He wanted it to look like an accident. Said you'd been drinking. Said it'd teach you a lesson. My pulse hammered. Richard Hale. His gaze didn't waver. Yeah, your stepdad. Paid cash, first wire later. 12 grand. Kept saying something about control, discipline, family disgrace. The words came out of him like poison draining from a wound. I could feel my nails digging into my palm. Why are you telling me this? He shrugged. Because I've seen enough blood to know when I crossed a line. You weren't some target overseas. You were a soldier. A woman just trying to go home. His voice softened rough with guilt. When you rolled that car, I aimed high. Missed by an inch on purpose. Don't ask me why. Maybe I wanted to believe in redemption. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The jukebox crackled. The rain outside grew heavier. I slid a small recorder onto the table, its red light blinking faintly. Say it again, I whispered. He stared at it, then at me. Your stepfather hired me to shoot you. And I did. My throat burned, but I didn't flinch. I ended the recording and stood. Then, you just gave me back my life. His eyes followed me as I walked out into the rain. I didn't look back. Some ghosts don't deserve forgiveness, only exposure. By the time I crossed back into North Carolina, dawn was rising over the highway like a slow fire. The windshield was streaked with rain, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The recording of Clint Mercer's confession played on repeat through my car speakers, his voice as steady and damning as a bullet. Your stepfather hired me to shoot you. And I did. Every time I heard it, the knot in my chest loosened a little more. Proof. Finally, proof. I drove straight to Fort Liberty, parking behind the liaison building before the rest of the staff arrived. Inside, the hum of the servers filled the early morning silence. I slipped the memory card from the recorder and loaded it onto my encrypted workstation. I played the file once more, letting the timestamp and GPS data embed in the metadata. No loopholes, no technical deniability. I sent one copy to the FBI Charlotte field office under a classified header and another to Army CID. In the subject line, I typed Evidence Attempted Murder of Lieutenant June Whitaker by Retentum Sergeant Richard Hale. My finger hovered over send for a long breath. Then I pressed it. The file disappeared into the digital ether, and I felt something shift inside me, a weight lifting, but not gone yet. I still needed allies who could keep this quiet until the system couldn't. That meant Captain Drew Foster and Maggie Rowe. I found them in the mess hall an hour later, Foster halfway through a cup of coffee, Maggie tapping through her phone. When they saw me, they both froze. You're supposed to be on light duty, Foster said, standing up. You don't look like light duty. I sat down, setting the flash drive on the table. We don't have time for small talk, I said. Maggie's expression changed the moment she saw the label Mercer recording. She grabbed it, plugged in her laptop, and hit play. For 2 full minutes, none of us moved. Just Mercer's rough voice confessing the deal, naming Richard Hale, describing the money, the plan, the shot. When it ended, Foster rubbed his jaw. He confessed to everything. On tape, I said. With timestamps and metadata. It's already at CID and FBI. He stared at me for a long moment, then gave a slow, proud nod. You really did it, June. Maggie leaned back, a fierce grin crossing her face. Your stepdad's going down. But my hands were still trembling. He's not the type to wait quietly. When he finds out what I've done, he'll run or worse. Foster folded his arms. Then we make sure he doesn't. I'll call in some favors. Maggie, keep an eye on comms traffic. If he moves any money, we'll know before he does. I exhaled the tension, leaving me in pieces. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like prey. I felt like the hunter. By the time the sun set over Fort Liberty, the base looked different. The same barracks, the same flags rippling against the wind, but something in the air had changed. Maybe it was me. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving a raw ache that wasn't physical. The day had been a blur of signatures, encrypted uploads, briefings behind closed doors. CID confirmed receipt of the evidence. The FBI assigned a case number. It was official now. Richard Hale wasn't just a shadow in my past. He was a target under investigation by federal law. But as the bureaucracy began to turn its gears, I knew better than to trust the system to move fast enough. He had money friends and the kind of charisma that made people doubt monsters could smile. I sat in my car outside the office long after everyone left, watching the streetlights flicker over the wet asphalt. The memory of Clint Mercer's voice still echoed in my head, steady, regretful, too human for comfort. He had aimed high on purpose. That mercy, that hesitation, was the only reason I was still breathing. I thought about how fragile justice really was, how easily it could be delayed, buried, or rewritten by the people who shouted the loudest. The silence between those walls wasn't peace. It was the sound of waiting for someone else to speak first. But this time, I would not wait. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out the small black notebook Maggie had given me weeks ago. The first pages were filled with facts, but the later ones had turned into something more, a war map drawn in ink and memory. Notes about Evelyn's withdrawals, the dinner where Richard toasted to family, the angle of the laser beam through the windshield, the sound of his voice over the phone. I ran my finger down the page until I reached the final line I'd written that morning. The only way out is through the truth. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, the kind that carries memory. I closed my eyes and listened. Each drop against the windshield sounded like the tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. When I opened them again, I saw my reflection in the glass, the faint scar, the tired eyes, the soldier who had survived her own family's war. Somewhere out there, Richard was still playing the part of the decorated mentor, maybe drinking whiskey and calling himself misunderstood. He had no idea how close his story was to ending. I started the engine and let the radio hum low beneath the sound of the storm. For a moment, I thought of my father, his letters, his calm strength, his belief that courage was measured not by battlefields but by what we refused to ignore. I understood him now. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about taking back the narrative he died, protecting honor without cruelty, discipline without fear, and love without ownership. The headlights cut through the mist as I pulled onto the empty road, the base lights fading in my mirror. My voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried all the certainty I had left. I'm coming for you, Richard. The Fayetteville Civic Center gleamed that night like a shrine to false heroism. Rows of brass plaques lined the entrance hall, and under the golden glow of chandeliers, men like Richard Hale thrived. The Veterans Memorial Banquet was an annual event, a parade of medals, handshakes, and patriotic speeches delivered by men who'd long forgotten what real service meant. Richard had been invited as the keynote speaker, honored for his decades of mentorship to young soldiers. I had read the program twice that morning, tracing his name printed in bold, the way people print scripture. Guest of honor Rhett, Sergeant Richard Hale. It had taken a year of silence of paperwork and testimony to reach this moment. The FBI had concluded its investigation. CID had completed its report. They had enough evidence to indict, but tonight wasn't about the courtroom. Tonight was about truth stripped of ceremony. Tonight was about exposure. Maggie met me outside the Civic Center, dressed in a formal uniform, her ribbons perfectly aligned. "You're sure you're ready for this?" she asked quietly. "Once this goes public, there's no walking it back." I adjusted my blazer, my scarf faint beneath the fabric. He built his life on pretending. It's time people see what he really is. Inside, the air buzzed with chatter and polished laughter. Tables were set with folded flags and crystal glasses. Richard stood at the far end of the room, shaking hands, his smile easy and familiar, the same one he'd worn at every Sunday dinner, every lie, every threat disguised as fatherly advice. I felt my stomach tighten, but Foster's steady voice grounded me. "Remember, he doesn't know the video's coming. Just breathe." At the head table, the announcer's voice echoed over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for our keynote speaker, Retired Sergeant Richard Hale." Applause filled the hall as Richard took the stage. He adjusted the microphone, scanning the crowd with that same confident smirk. "Thank you," he began, his voice smooth as polished brass. "It's humbling to stand among those who've sacrificed so much. To serve one's country is an honor, but to guide the next generation, that's the real duty." I watched him from the third row, every word scraping against memory. He talked about integrity, discipline, the importance of family values. The audience nodded. He was a master manipulator selling virtue with the same voice he used to command fear. And then just as he paused for effect, the lights dimmed. A low hum filled the air. Richard frowned, tapping the mic. "Is there a problem with the—" The projector on the far wall flickered to life. The first sound was Mercer's voice. "Your stepfather hired me to shoot you." And I did. Gasps cut through the room like gunfire. Faces turned. Richard froze, his smile collapsing into disbelief. The confession rolled on Mercer, detailing the money, the plan, the night. No one moved. No one breathed. By the time the lights came back up, Richard's mask had cracked completely. His hand trembled as he reached for the microphone. This is a fabrication," he stammered. "A lie." But truth had already detonated. The room no longer saw a mentor. They saw a predator cornered by his own past. The silence that followed was the kind that could swallow a man whole. For a long moment, no one moved. Forks hovered mid-air, applause frozen in disbelief. The recording echoed through the speakers one last time. Mercer's rough voice, deliberate, irrefutable. "Your stepfather hired me to shoot you. And I did." Then the screen went black. The lights brightened slowly, exposing the faces of the audience officers, veterans, donors, all staring at Richard Hale. He stood rigid behind the podium, his fingers gripping the edges so hard his knuckles turned white. "This is absurd," he barked, his composure fracturing. "Some kind of digital trick. My stepdaughter's imagination." That was when the sound of boots on marble broke the stillness. 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered from the side doors, followed by Major Drew Foster in dress uniform. The gold insignia on Foster's chest caught the light as he stepped forward, voice firm and controlled. "Mr. Hale," he announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit attempted murder of Lieutenant June Whitaker." The words carried through the hall like a verdict. The agents moved in sync, approaching the stage. Richard backed away from the podium, shaking his head violently. "You can't. This is a mistake. You're basing this on the word of a disgraced mercenary." "On the word," Foster replied, "and on verified financial records, communication logs, and your own transfers traced through Evelyn Hale's account." The crowd murmured, tension rippling through the room like a tide. Richard's eyes darted toward the tables, searching for allies among the faces that once worshipped him. He found none. The applause had turned into distance, admiration into revulsion. That was when I rose. Every step toward the stage felt like crossing a decade's worth of nightmares. I could feel the heat of the lights, the gaze of hundreds, the faint ache beneath my scar. Richard's eyes locked on mine, shock, rage, and fear twisting behind the practiced calm. "June," he hissed, "you don't understand. They're turning you against family." I stopped just below the stage. "Family doesn't hire a man to kill their own," I said, voice steady, almost soft. The microphone still picked it up, echoing across the silent hall. "You told me control was love. You taught me obedience was safety. But what you really taught me was how to recognize a coward in uniform." His face darkened, the confident mask slipping completely. "You'll regret this," he spat, voice cracking under the weight of exposure. "I already did," I said. 10 years ago." Foster nodded at the agents. They stepped forward, cuffing Richard's wrists in front of everyone, officers who once saluted him, wives who once trusted his councilmen, who once called him mentor. Cameras flashed, recording every second of his fall. Evelyn appeared in the crowd, pale and shaking. She didn't move to stop them, she just whispered his name as if mourning a ghost. As they led him past me, Richard turned once more. "This isn't over," he muttered. I met his stare, cold and certain. "For you, it is." The courthouse smelled of varnish and old air conditioning, that peculiar mix of dust and authority. The trial began 3 months after the arrest. The headlines had already run their course. Decorated veteran charged in stepdaughter's shooting, but the courtroom was packed anyway. Soldiers, reporters, locals from Fayetteville. Everyone wanted to see whether justice would stand its ground against legacy. I sat at the witness table beside the prosecution, my uniform, crisp, my hands steady on the folder in front of me. Across the room, Richard looked smaller than I remembered. The orange jumpsuit stripped him of the authority he'd worn like armor for years. His hair was thinner now, his eyes restless. But even shackled, he tried to command the space. His chin high, his smirk half-formed like he still believed he could out-talk the truth. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The sound of chairs scraping echoed like a ritual cleansing. Then it began. The state versus Richard Hale. The prosecutor opened with precision, laying out the facts like coordinates on a map. The payments, the phone records, the recording. The recovered firearm Mercer surrendered under immunity. Then came the witnesses. Maggie was first. She walked to the stand in full uniform, calm, unflinching. "I've served with Lieutenant Whitaker for 7 years," she told the court. "She's disciplined, rational, and not prone to fantasy. The evidence she collected aligns perfectly with her report." She handed over the original notepad I'd written in at the hospital, now sealed in plastic. The defense tried to undermine her, implying bias, friendship emotion. Maggie didn't blink. "You can question my loyalty," she said evenly, "but not my integrity." Then they called Clint Mercer. He walked in wearing a plain suit, eyes lowered. The courtroom tensed, the hired gun in flesh and blood. When he took the oath, his voice trembled once, then steadied. "Mr. Hale approached me through an intermediary. He offered payment to make the lieutenant's death look accidental. Said she'd been disobedient. Said she needed to be taught a lesson." The defense objected, tried to paint him as unreliable, but the prosecutor countered by playing the full confession recording. Mercer's own voice filled the room again. Richard winced like the sound was acid. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness box, every step measured. I took the oath, sat down, and faced him directly. "Lieutenant Whitaker," the prosecutor said. "Do you recognize the defendant?" "Yes," I replied. "He's my stepfather. Can you describe your relationship?" I met Richard's eyes. He taught me how to follow orders, then punished me for thinking for myself. When he realized I couldn't be controlled anymore, he tried to erase me. The defense rose desperate. "You're emotional, Lieutenant. Isn't it possible you're projecting resentment onto him?" I didn't look away. Resentment doesn't leave bullet scars. Evidence does. The jury stayed silent, but their faces said everything. The illusion of the proud mentor had shattered. For the first time in his life, Richard Hale couldn't command the room. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, but it felt like 6 years. The courtroom lights dimmed with the afternoon sun, and every tick of the clock sounded like an echo of the night he tried to end me. I sat in silence, hands folded, eyes fixed on the empty witness stand where truth had finally stood its ground. Maggie sat 2 rows behind me, a silent anchor. Foster was farther back, arms crossed, gaze unblinking. No one spoke. Even the reporters whispered, as if words might disturb the gravity of what was coming. When the bailiff opened the door and the jurors filed in, the air tightened. The foreman's face was pale, his lips pressed thin, the weight of justice in his trembling hands. The judge's voice broke the stillness. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, paper in hand. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit attempted murder of Lieutenant June Whitaker, we find the defendant Richard Hale guilty." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then it rippled through the room, gasps, murmurs, the sharp intake of disbelief. Richard's head jerked up, his mouth falling open as if the word itself had struck him. "No," he whispered. "No, you don't understand. I built her. Everything she is, I made her." He turned toward me, his face twisting between rage and panic. "You'd be nothing without me. June. Nothing." I didn't move. I just looked at him calm and level, letting the silence answer for me. The judge's gavel struck once sharp and final. "Order in the court!" Richard surged to his feet, the guards catching him before he could reach the table. His voice broke into a desperate shout. "I taught you discipline. I gave you everything." The judge's tone cut through him like steel. "You taught her survival, Mr. Hale, and she learned it well." The guards dragged him back, his protests unraveling into incoherent noise. I watched not with triumph, but with something deeper release. He wasn't a father or a mentor or even an enemy anymore. He was just a man stripped of his illusions, standing naked before the consequence he always thought belonged to others. Evelyn was in the gallery, tears streaking her face. She looked at me once, guilt flickering in her eyes, then dropped her gaze to the floor. I didn't hate her anymore. Pity had taken its place. The verdict wasn't just against Richard, it was against every silence that had let him thrive. As the guards led him away, he turned one last time, eyes wild. "This isn't forgiveness," he spat. "No," I said softly. "It's freedom." He was gone before the words finished leaving my lips. When the courtroom emptied, Maggie reached me first. "It's over," she said quietly. I shook my head. "No, it's just begun." Outside, the evening light poured across the courthouse steps, washing the city in gold. I stood there for a long time, the wind cold against my scar, my heartbeat steady for the first time in years. Justice wasn't loud, it was steady, deliberate, and finally mine. Tomorrow I'd leave for the coast, but tonight I let the silence wrap around me like peace earned. The kind that doesn't forget, the kind that rebuilds. 8 months after the trial, the Atlantic had become my sanctuary. Every morning before sunrise, I walked along the dunes of the Outer Banks, the salt wind cutting clean through whatever ghosts tried to follow. The waves broke steady against the shore, measured unhurried, eternal. It was the rhythm of survival, not victory. I rented a small cottage outside Kill Devil Hills, the kind with peeling paint and a porch that creaked when the wind turned inland. It suited me. I didn't need grand gestures. I needed space to breathe, to teach, to begin again. 3 days a week, I ran a women's survival program for veterans and abuse survivors through a local outreach group. We called it the Second Tour. The motto on the wall read, "Not every battle ends with war." My students came from everywhere. Single mothers retired, medics, women who'd learned to hide their bruises behind perfect smiles. I taught them how to make fire, navigate terrain, read the sky, and most importantly, how to stop apologizing for existing. Each session felt like watching a flame catch in a dozen hearts that once thought they'd gone cold. During breaks, they'd ask about the scar beneath my collarbone. I'd tell them it was a reminder that some wounds close from the inside first. They'd nod, some with tears, some with understanding. In those moments, I realized the truth. Survival isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself they tried to erase. One afternoon after class, I returned home to find an envelope on my porch. No return address, just my name written in shaky cursive. My heart tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a folded letter, the paper smudged as though it had been handled too long. June, it began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you'll read this knowing I finally see what I refused to face for 30 years. I let him control me because I was afraid of being alone. I let him hurt you because I thought silence kept you safe. I was wrong. I'm in therapy now. They tell me healing starts with truth. I hope someday you'll write back. I still keep your father's picture on my nightstand. He'd be proud of you. Mom." I read it twice. My first instinct was to burn it to end the cycle of pity and regret. But then I folded it back neatly and set it on the windowsill where the wind could move it if it wanted. Some things don't need answers. Some stories end in quiet acceptance, not reconciliation. Outside, the tide was rising. I stood on the porch, breathing in the ocean air, feeling the sting of salt against my skin, the kind of sting that meant life, not pain. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, a new student joined the second tour. Her name was Leah McAdams, 32, sharp eyes, shoulders hunched as though the world had been teaching her to stay small. She didn't speak much during introductions, just offered a quiet nod when I welcomed her. But on the second day, when I handed her a compass and asked her to navigate a trail through the dunes, she froze. Her hands trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes darting toward the ocean. "He used to follow me when I ran. I never learned how to stop looking over my shoulder." I recognized that fear immediately. It was the kind that lodges deep in the muscle, the kind that outlives bruises. I stepped closer and placed my hand over hers. "Then we'll start with something smaller," I said. "You don't have to run today. Just take one step without looking back." She did. And that step, hesitant and shaking, felt like watching my younger self move forward for the first time. Over the next few weeks, Leah grew stronger. She learned how to tie knots, read terrain, even lead the group through the forested path near Kitty Hawk. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the water, she stayed behind while the others packed up. "You said once that silence nearly killed you," she began softly. "Did you mean that literally I turned toward the waves?" "Yes," I said. "Because silence doesn't protect us, it protects them." The moment I spoke, the world changed. Painful, yes, but also honest. She was quiet for a moment, watching the tide pull away. "I think I'm ready to speak too," she said finally. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake her words. They echoed in the same place that used to hold my fear. I remembered the years I spent trying to shrink myself to fit inside Richard's idea of obedience, the way my mother folded her voice into submission, the way so many women learned to disappear for peace. But standing here now, teaching others to reclaim their strength, I realized something profound. His voice no longer lived inside me. His memory didn't dictate my worth, my choices, or my fear. He was gone, not just in prison, but in relevance. I parked by the shore and stepped out, letting the cold night wind press against my skin. Above me, the stars stretched across the sky, endless and silent. For the first time in years, I understood that silence could mean peace instead of danger. I wasn't the girl on Riley Road anymore. I was the woman who survived her own war and built a bridge for others to cross theirs. The wind shifted that night, bringing the scent of rain and seaweed across the dunes. The cottage lights flickered as I sat at the kitchen table staring at Evelyn's letter one last time. The paper had yellowed slightly from the salt air edges, curled ink faded but legible. I read it again, every word still trembling between guilt and love, every apology shaped by years too late to matter. She wanted forgiveness. But forgiveness isn't something you ask for. It's something time either grants or doesn't. I took the letter outside and stood on the sand, the ocean whispering behind me like an old companion. My hands didn't shake this time. I struck a match, shielding it from the wind. The flame caught quickly, climbing the page until the words turned black and curled inward. "I was wrong," the final line read before it dissolved to ash. The smoke drifted upward, fragile, then vanished into the night. I felt no anger, only release. The surf rolled in soft and deliberate, and I spoke to the darkness, not expecting an answer. "You can rest now, Mom. I already forgave you the day I stopped needing your permission to live." The tide hissed like a sigh, pulling the ashes toward the water. I watched until the last ember disappeared, leaving only stars above and the rhythmic pull of the waves below. Later, as I walked back to the porch, the sound of laughter reached me from the campfire down the beach, my students, their voices strong and alive. Leah's laugh rang out above the rest. I smiled. Survival isn't a finish line, it's a continuum, a transfer of courage from one soul to another. I sat on the porch rail watching the horizon melt into silver. My scar caught the moonlight, no longer a mark of pain, but of endurance. My father's words returned to me, his voice from a letter long ago. Courage isn't born in battle, June. It's built in the quiet afterward when no one's watching. He was right. Courage isn't the moment the bullet misses your heart, it's the choice to keep living after it does. The camera would fade there, I thought, if this were someone else's story. But for me, it was only the next chapter. I leaned forward, speaking softly into the night, my voice carrying over the hum of the ocean. If you've ever survived what was meant to destroy you, don't hide your scars. They're proof you made it through. Share this story, tell your own, and remind someone tonight they're not alone. The waves answered in steady rhythm. I let the silence linger, letting it mean peace this time. Then I whispered one last line, not to the past, but to the future. My heart was supposed to stop that night. Instead, it started over. The mornings came easier now. I woke before dawn, long before the rest of the island stirred and brewed my coffee in silence. The ritual had become my grounding, the steam curling through the dim kitchen light, the sound of waves breaking steady against the shore. Outside, the horizon waited in its soft, gray calm, the kind that held promise instead of threat. Each sunrise reminded me that I was still here, still breathing in a world that once decided I shouldn't be. Sometimes, when the first students arrived for training, they'd find me sitting on the porch steps, notebook in hand, the same one Maggie gave me in the hospital. Its pages were full now, names, stories, fragments of women who'd walked through the fire and learned to build from the ashes. I no longer filled it with evidence or anger. These days, I wrote lessons on endurance, on fear, on finding light after being left in the dark. The last page held only one sentence. Every scar is a map back to yourself. Leah stayed after most of the sessions ended, helping me repair the old shed behind the cottage. She was stronger now, her voice steady, her laughter unguarded. Sometimes she'd look at me as if trying to understand how someone could lose so much and still find peace. I told her the truth. It wasn't peace I'd found, it was purpose. And purpose keeps you breathing when peace feels too far away. News from the mainland came rarely, but when it did, it carried its own kind of quiet justice. Richard Hale's final appeal had been denied. He would serve his full sentence. The report mentioned he rarely spoke, that he spent most days alone in the prison yard staring at the sky. I didn't feel satisfaction, only distance, as if that entire part of my life had belonged to someone else. Maybe that was the final victory. Not revenge, but separation. One evening, as the sun sank low, Maggie visited the coast. She brought 2 bottles of beer and the same dry humor that once kept me alive in the barracks. We sat on the porch as gulls cut through the pink sky. "You ever think about leaving here?" she asked. I shook my head. "I left once. It almost killed me. This time I'm staying." She smiled, lifting her bottle in a mock salute. To survival, I raised mine. No, to freedom. We drank in silence, the kind that meant peace, not fear. The tide crept closer, kissing the edge of the dunes. The stars began to show one by one like quiet witnesses. Later, when Maggie left and the cottage fell still, I stood outside again. The ocean stretched endless and open, reflecting the light of a moon I no longer feared. I closed my eyes, breathed in the salt and night air, and whispered into the wind, "I made it home."